Okay, so as we are learning this new theory of Gestalt, I'm going to give you some examples about how you may approach this for our assignment. So remember, what we're going to be doing is we're going to, for the objectives, we're going to be based on the theme of generosity. And we talked about that a little bit yesterday, brainstorming. What do we think of when we think of generosity? And people said things like kindness and things like giving and love and warmth and right all sorts of different things that may bring up some visual imagery for you. Things people said things like hearts and hands and gifts and people hugging and people holding hands and all sorts of different things that people started to think about, okay, as imagery associated with this idea of generosity. Okay, but what we're trying to do is we're trying to figure out how can we create this idea of generosity as if you would imagine like a logo or some simple drawing that will represent figure ground, proximity, similarity, common fate, continuity, and closure, which are all 6 different Gestalt principles that I covered over the last couple of days. Okay, so you're end up creating little thumbnail sketches or little drawings no larger than 2 inches by 2 inches to represent each one of those Gestalt principles. Okay, and you can reference the attached handout on this assignment down here. I have it open up on the other side. And you're going to have to make sure to label each thumbnail with the Gestalt principle you illustrated. And the last step, obviously, with all assignments, is to take a clear photo of that work, and you're attaching it to this Google Classroom assignment. Okay, so just getting into it, how you might approach this. Okay, so let's say I was working on the idea of figure ground. Okay, and with figure ground, right, our minds seek to separate a figure from the background. One way to do this is to actually start with a figure and then erase away to kind of create this figure ground relationship like you can see down here. So what do I mean? Okay, let's say I was working on the idea of education. And one simple theme that sometimes comes to mind with education might be like an apple, like associated with a teacher. So maybe I would start out by drawing that apple, okay, and then I could then fill that apple in, okay, and now that I have just the figure, now I want to work on the ground. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to use my eraser tool, and then I'm just going to start erasing away a part of this apple. So maybe I want to do it like in the profile of a teacher. So they have their forehead, their nose coming out, the lip, right? And then I could maybe make my eraser a little bit larger. But for you, you'd be drawing in pencil on a piece of paper, and you could just draw a solid object and then erase away a portion of that object. And what you're getting is a figure ground relationship. Okay, so you draw the thing out in relationship to generosity. This is about teaching, but this is a figure ground relationship. Okay, so the next one. Okay, if I look over at the handout over here, proximity. Okay, if I think about proximity, it's the idea that there's a distance that creates a relationship. The closer things are together, the more they are related. The farther apart, the less they are related. Okay? And so the idea, when I look at this, remember we talked about this yesterday, I see the triangle because those circles are grouped together in proximity to one another, close enough that I can actually make out a group, the grouping of a triangle. Okay, so let's say, similar, we can see the tree here, even though if we look at the individual parts, it's a bunch of people. So if I was to take that concept in relationship to generosity, I would have to start thinking about what could I do to create a bunch of little things close enough together that I read it as something else. So let's say I was taking a different concept other than generosity, and let's say I was having something to do with like bugs. Okay, I could start to draw like a little bug, right, maybe with wings. And then if I start grouping them so that they're close enough together, right, I might be able to create a shape of something. Okay, so maybe if I'm grouping them together, I could make the shape of a circle. Or maybe I could make it the shape of a bug spray can. If let me say my business was an exterminator, right? Maybe I could create a logo, right, where it was sort of the shape of a bug spray can, right? And because they're close enough together, I'm starting to group them all as one thing, okay? So proximity is basically a grouping of something that we read as one because they're so close together. Proximity, okay? All right. Now, next concept, similarity, okay? Similarity, our brain perceives things as grouped together when they are like each other, okay? When they're very much like each other or have similar attributes, okay? We start to group them together. We talked about this yesterday, where we perceive this as 4 separate squares because the circles are close enough together, just like they were showing proximity up here. We've grouped those together using proximity, but because these are different, we group together the squares as one kind of object, a plus sign, and we group together the circles as these 4 separate squares. Similarly here, we look at the individual child grouped separately from all of the people, okay? In the logo, we kind of see 2 distinct groups, but we read it kind of all as one because they all have that circle shape inside of it. So again, how do I approach this? Basically, you just draw a bunch of similar things and sort of group them together. And then you could also work on the idea of creating contrast or something different that stands out from it. Okay, so let's say I was taking and just using, let's say, fish as an example. I could draw out a fish shape, okay, and then I could draw out another fish shape. And because they're similar, I start to group these things together, okay? I start to group these because they are similar in shape, okay? And size, okay? And also, in this case, color. So we're starting to group them. You can see it's very much like proximity, but let's say I did this. Let's say I took and I started coloring these in, and I colored in 5 of those fish green and 1 of them yellow. All of a sudden, I'm creating a different grouping. The idea that I read all those green fish together as one group, and then all of a sudden that yellow fish stands out. This is the Gestalt principle of similarity, okay? Similarity. All right. So next, closure, okay? Closure is the visual relationship of figures that suggests or implies another visual image. We tend to close the gap to make the image whole. So when we talked about this yesterday, we looked at the idea that we could read the circle around the outside of that soccer ball even though it didn't exist. We could see the triangle in between these circles even though it's just a cutout of circles. There is no lines connecting them. Our brain fills in the gap. That is what is closure. So one way to approach closure that I think you might use the first time doing this is to actually start by drawing an entire object. So let's say I was doing something for a shoe store, okay? I could actually start by, let's say, drawing that shoe. So let me just draw this shoe, okay? And maybe I'm just going to start adding some shapes to this to kind of, in order to do closure, you have to have some solid shapes that can help you, right, determine something about that object, okay? So now I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to fill in those shapes, okay? Let me zoom in and get a little closer on this. Sorry. I'm going to fill in those shapes. Okay, and now Now that I've got those shapes filled in, I'm going to come back with my eraser and I'm going to erase away some of these lines that connect it, okay? The thinner lines, not the shapes, but the lines that connect some of those objects, right? And what's going to happen is our brain can still read that is shoe, right? I almost feel the line that I erased along the bottom because of the way that these other shapes are connected, right? I can feel the curve of that shoe on one side or the other as it touches the laces and the top of the shoe. So that is a good way to approach this idea, what we call closure. Okay? Closure. All right. We're going to skip over symmetry because that we talked about that, the balance on both sides like a butterfly. Fairly easy concept to get. So we're going to skip over to this one, common fate or continuation. Okay? Our minds tend to perceive things following the smoothest path. Based on our understanding or physics, we perceive the direction of a path an image will take. Okay? So if I'm trying to create continuation, you can see that this swoop of a line is helping us draw our eye from one area to the next. The way that the rhythm of the circles or the heads are drawing our eye across to this person that's jumping, as well as the arms, the lines of the arms, the line of that curve that's coming across, getting thicker to get thin, and also the triangular shape that we see in the legs is helping create a rhythm that draws our eye over to this other form. Okay, so one way to do that, I might, let's say, coming back over here, maybe I want to create a rhythm. Okay, and I'm going to use both rhythm by creating shapes. Okay, and the rhythm I'm going to create is kind of a smaller shape, and then a larger shape, and then a larger shape, right? I'm kind of creating these larger shapes and filling them in. Okay, and already because there's some implied, almost like closure lines too, getting connected. I start to read this going from big to small. My eye is being drawn towards this bigger area, okay? So let's say I do one more. I'm just going to use the fill tool to save some time. Okay, and now I draw some object on the top of it, right? My eye is sort of drawn to that object because of this staggering or rhythm as it draws our eye there. It creates movement. I could even further enhance that by maybe erasing away a line that draws. I'll just do it a little thicker so you can kind of really get a sense of it. By erasing away and creating a line, you can see, this idea of continuation. It's drawing from one area of a composition to another, right? Using lines, using rhythm. Okay, so this we call common fate or continuation, common fate. Okay, or continuation is another word for it, another way to say it. Continuation. Okay, so I'm just going to shrink these and move them a little bit. All right, so the last one, continuity. Okay, continuity and common fate are similar. So if I'm looking over here, right, I've got this idea of continuity similar to common fate. Continuity is the idea that our minds will group together objects that have the same motion. So the italics of this Coca-Cola and the swooping curves help guide our eye, right? These little curves we just keep following around and around and around. Okay, our eye gets drawn by objects that have a very similar motion. Okay, so one thing, let's say I was doing like something, use my fish example again. If I am drawing a fish, and it's swimming in this direction, and then even though it's kind of curving or going a little bit differently, it's still swimming in the same direction. So my eye is very much has a tendency to follow that direction. It's going to follow the line that is being created. Okay, if you kind of go against it, if all of a sudden, right, let's say I was trying to create continuity and I've got these things going in one direction, then all of a sudden I have something going in a different direction, it upsets the continuity. I starts to get drawn up here, and then boom, it gets stopped by that. It's a distractor. So because there's a brokenness or unsimilar part of it, the continuity is lost. It doesn't have a continuous flow. It gets interrupted. So that wouldn't be a good example of it. Okay, you'd want to try to have things going all in the same direction, right? In the same direction, it's going to have a continuity to it. Okay, so just again using my example of the fish to finish that one off. All right, I can draw more fish as long as they're going in the same direction, right? And you can see all of these Gestalt principles are really kind of related to each other, and the idea that, right, common fate, right, that there's a movement here, okay, that's drawing our eye through. Proximity, we're starting to group these all together as one thing because they're so close together. Similarity, we're reading them all as one thing because of the shape. They're all a similar shape. We start to group them together. Okay, so all of these Gestalt principles can kind of work off of each other, okay, and are very similar to each other. Figure ground, proximity, similarity, closure, common fate, continuum, and continuity. Okay, continuity. Okay, so again, your goal, again, hopefully you learned a little bit about how you might approach these different thumbnail sketches, is to, based on the theme of generosity, create 6 individual drawings that represent each one of those Gestalt principles. Okay, all right, that's the end of the lesson.